My name is Bryce, and I was 7 years old in 1998. Yet some of my favorite albums and some of the most meaningful albums to me ever came out that year. Weird how that works, right? But yet we live in the age of the internet, where we can find music from the past relatively easily from all different cultures and all different genres and experience them like new with a fresh perspective. And that's what this video series is about. I'm going to be going back to different years in music history, taking a look at the top 10 albums from those years from today's perspective. Well, my biased perspective, to be completely honest, but still from today's perspective. And today we'll be going back to 1998, where we'll go through each of the albums on this list, take a look through the history of each one, and talk a little bit about why it's on the list. And if you disagree or think I forgot anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. Got it? Well, let's get started.
Number 10.
At number 10, we have Black Star, with Mos Def and Talib Kweli are Black Star, a collaborative album between, you guessed it, Mos Def and Talib Kweli. Both men are Brooklyn MCs who, at this point, are probably more well known for their solo work. Mos Def released an excellent album just a year after this one called Black on Both Sides, and Talib Kweli teamed up with DJ Hi-Tech, who does some production work for this album as well, to form Reflection Eternal and release Train of Thought in the year 2000. And in going back and listening to this album, I'd actually forgotten that this was the debut album for both men. This album sounds so polished, and right from the start, Mos Def and Talib Kweli have so much chemistry together that it doesn't really come across like a debut album when you're listening to it, but it is. And while this album didn't necessarily make the biggest impact on mainstream hip-hop when it came out, it did come out at a very important time for hip-hop. Tupac, Notorious B.I.G., two of the biggest icons in hip-hop, had been killed within the last 2 years, and mainstream hip-hop had changed considerably as a result. You started seeing less gangster music, less hardcore hip-hop, less violent lyrics in hip-hop as artists like Will Smith and Puff Daddy were topping the charts, and in the underground you started seeing some more of those hardcore artists, some more of those classic boom-bap artists, and you started to see a bigger divide between the type of content that was in mainstream hip-hop at the time and would go on to form the underground hip-hop of the 2000s. But stylistically, Black Star were fitting into more of the conscious side of hip-hop, and the themes of the album that dealt with what it's like to be a black man in America were certainly not unusual for New York hip-hop at the time. There were plenty of other Afrocentric hip-hop albums that had come out within the last decade. It certainly felt like it had been a while since an album had come out from New York that didn't have a rough exterior to it. You look at a track like Definition, which was the lead single on the album, and right in the album's chorus, they reference the death of Tupac and Biggie and explicitly condemn violence in hip-hop, a theme that would continue throughout the remainder of the album. Black Star was an album that was greatly influenced by hardcore hip-hop, but more so in its beat selection and in how it reflected on those lyrics and in the references that it brought to the table, as opposed to putting the same style on display. Again, since that time, both Mos and Talib have rose to prominence and have become more famous than they were when Black Star came out, and because of that, Black Star is an album that is much more well known today than it was back in 1998, but it's also just a great hip-hop album that not only has some of the best songs that Mos and Talib have ever recorded, but has some of the best hip-hop songs of the late 90s.
Number 9.
Up next, we have Trilogie de la Mort, a 3-hour drone collection from French minimalist synth pioneer Eliane Radigue. The album was composed entirely on an ARP 2500 synthesizer that was quite popular in that time with electronic music and rock music, and this album in particular was influenced by Tibetan Buddhism, as was partially a musical adaptation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and partially a tribute to Eliane's son, who passed away in a car accident during the record's composition. And Eliane was 66 years old when this album was released. However, technology had kind of caught up to the vision that she had, as vinyl would not allow for hour-long drone compositions to be released without a pause, and in making this album, which is comprised of 3 one-hour tracks composed between 1985 and 1993, Eliane had made something that was both meditative and minimalistic, but also contained long compositions with significant weight and power to them. The first track, Kiema, deals with the concept of intermediate states and moves between vastly different pieces of music that represent different parts of consciousness. You have a pulsating beat representing birth at the start, with dark and heavy noise representing death that sounds straight out of a horror film, with sections in between that range from barely more than static sounds to clear and gorgeously atmospheric sections that represent dreams but evokes everything pure and beautiful about our world. The second track, Kalasha, has a much more bass-heavy sound that overwhelms the music at times and rattles around in your headphones. It's supposedly meant to represent a trek through the Himalayan mountains, and it certainly makes sense with how deep and spacious everything sounds. And finally, Kum ends the trilogy with a dark, reverberating drone that brings connotations of death with it, taking its slow time to build to one of the most incredible moments of the album out of completely nowhere, nearly a half hour into a track that had barely changed up to that point. It's both a physically and emotionally powerful way to end one of the greatest collections of drone music we've ever seen, and it cements Trilogie de la Mort as an utter masterpiece of experimental composition.
Number 8.
At number 8, we have what is probably the most popular album of any that is on this list, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, the first and only solo album from Lauryn Hill, a rapper, singer, former member of the Fugees, and at one brief point, one of the biggest stars in American music. The lead single from this album, Doo-Wop, became the first song to ever debut at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and that followed with the album breaking the record for most first-week album sales from a female artist. And then, nothing. The less we bring up about Lauryn Hill's career after the year 2000, the better, so let's just focus on this album, which is a classic, and has turned out to be incredibly influential in the 20 years since its release. One of the major reasons for that is because this is one of the first examples of neo-soul reaching the mainstream. Neo-soul is essentially a mix of soul music with more contemporary elements, such as hip-hop, jazz, electronic music, or a number of other potential styles. And on this particular record, there are elements of hip-hop, soul, R&B, gospel, and reggae, and there's even still debate to this day about whether this qualifies as a hip-hop album, despite Lauryn Hill rapping on about half of the tracks, and just about every song on the album having hip-hop beats. And if you're ever doubting Lauryn Hill's ability to rap, just listen to the first track on this record, Lost Ones, a track where she comments on her split with the Fugees. It's a hard song to open an album that is honestly very vulnerable for a lot of it, and I've honestly always found Lauryn Hill to be a stronger rapper than a singer. As much as I like some of the soul-oriented tracks on this album, and while some of them are honestly really spectacular, a lot of them do come across as kind of samey, and I wish that we had seen more of her really amazing ability as an MC. But this is not just a good collection of hip-hop and neo-soul tracks. There's a concept to the miseducation of Lauryn Hill that is absolutely worth hearing, and one of the reasons why it's remained a classic in these 20 years. This is an album that deals with themes that range from education and childhood, to relationships and love, to motherhood, and simply what it means to be a black woman in America. And there really are not enough albums out there about what it means to be a mother, especially a black mother and a black woman in America, especially in hip-hop. And this was an album that was able to weave all of these themes together through its music and comes together as one of the most genuine portrayals of a human being I've ever heard in hip-hop music. Very few people could make an album that is as equal parts political and personal and tying all of those themes together the way that Lauryn Hill did here, while also making it a super accessible album that just about anybody could come to and appreciate, which is one of the reasons why it was so popular when it came out. And it's really a shame that we never had a proper follow-up to The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, because it is such a genuine classic of pop, soul, and yes, hip-hop music, and so few people, even 20 years later, have been able to convey these same themes in the way that Lauryn Hill did here.
Number 7.
We have one of the best technical death metal albums ever made with Obscura from Gorguts. Gorguts are a Canadian death metal band and one of the most forward-thinking bands in metal. However, that wasn't always the case. In the early 90s, they released 2 albums that were fine, but completely unremarkable death metal albums. Then they took a 5-year gap and came back with Obscura, an album that was far more sinister, far more brooding and far more twisted than anything the genre had seen before. This album builds off of what bands like Atheist, Atrocity, Cynic, and Nocturnus were doing with the technical side of the genre in the early 90s, but comes back with something far darker and far more avant-garde than anything death metal had seen, and really anything death metal would see for even the next decade or so. It wasn't until we started seeing bands like Deathspell Omega, Ulcerate, and of course Obscura, who named themselves after this album, where we would see a similar combination of raw brutality, brooding atmosphere, and virtuosic technicality all coming together into the same style of music. But even then, there's still something unique about the particular blend of darkness that Gorguts brought to the table on this record. The moment that you hear that unmistakable guitar slide just a few measures in, you know that this is not going to be your average death metal record. And even in most death metal records, there's still a kind of comfort that you can find in the brutality and the familiarity of it, you know, if you're a fan of that sort of thing, of course. But Obscura did something different. Like most technical death metal records, it's an album that's full of changing rhythms and time signatures, but Gorguts used that to add to the atmosphere in a way that makes the whole album sound uneasy. Like, this thing was just so dissonant and would rarely settle on one thing for very long. The whole experience just became unsettling and super tense, which is awesome for a death metal album. This is one of the first albums to really do that super well in that genre. You'd have tracks like Nostalgia, where the brutality and atmosphere of the record would be used to create a ton of tension and release it into surprising moments of groovier sounds. And even the vocals here add to the tension, as Luc Lemay sounds like he's desperately fighting for his life on every track. And look, if you're not a fan of death metal and this album just sounds like the worst thing in the world, I get it, it's cool. But just know that Gorguts didn't just make one of these albums. This is not a typical death metal album or just another average tech death record. This was an album that changed things for death metal and was so far ahead of its time that you can even go back now, as technical death metal has kind of become the in thing within death metal's small pool of fans, and find something totally unique about the way this thing sounds even 20 years later. It's an odd bit of experimental metal that, despite its influence, is still unlike anything else out there.
Number 6.
At number 6, we move to Mezzanine, the third album from the British electronic duo Massive Attack, who all but invented trip-hop in the early 90s, a chill cross between hip-hop and electronic music found on their 1991 debut Blue Lines. However, in the years since, that style has started to move on from Massive Attack. Artists like Portishead had both cleaned up and experimented with that style on their 1994 debut Dummy, while former Massive Attack collaborator Tricky also released a more experimental take on that genre in 1995, and even outside of trip-hop itself, artists like DJ Shadow and Aphex Twin were merging electronic with hip-hop elements in ways that went far outside of the very simple style that Massive Attack were going for on Blue Lines and the relatively similar follow-up Protection, to the point where it felt like Massive Attack needed to do something new, something different for their third album. And then they released Mezzanine. And right from the start, Mezzanine presents itself as something entirely different from Massive Attack. The opening segments on Angel, the track that begins the album, are ominous sounding and build to a track that is far darker than anything that could be called trip-hop at the time, let alone anything that was on the first two Massive Attack albums. And while that dark tone doesn't necessarily make its way through the rest of the album, the experimentation does. And a lot of the tracks seem to come from what Massive Attack were listening to and borrowing from various parts of the UK alternative scene at the time. Take, for example, Teardrop, which is of course the most famous song on the album and easily the most famous song in Massive Attack's entire discography, and a track that features the Cocteau Twins' Elizabeth Fraser on vocals. But that song, even in the instrumental, borrows heavily from the dream pop scene that Cocteau Twins were from. It feels like a trip-hop song in its roots, but it has a dreamier and sparser atmosphere than what Massive Attack were doing on their earlier songs, that's immediately followed by Inertia Creeps, which takes the type of fuzzy guitars that you would expect from a 90s alternative rock song, but brings it back into the electronic landscape of the rest of the album. And then you get the almost drone-like guitar over turntables of a track like Dissolve Girl, or the dub rhythms of a song like Man Next Door, and all kinds of post-punk samples and influences throughout the record. It's just such a varied album in a way that you would not expect from Massive Attack's first two records, as it's a perfect example of stretching an artist's sound as far as it can possibly go without losing the core of why they were interesting to begin with. It was also a huge influence on artists like the Gorillaz, particularly if you go back and listen to Demon Days, where you have all of these different sounds from hip-hop, electronic, alternative rock, and these different styles being mixed together into the same framework with all of these guest features. It's a lot of what Mezzanine did, and Demon Days certainly borrowed the framework from that album. But much like Demon Days, the biggest strength of Mezzanine is that despite all of these individual highlights and all of these eclectic individual songs, the album flows very well. It all comes back to the same framework and is never inaccessible.
Number 5.
At number 5, we have Refused with The Shape of Punk to Come, named after the 1959 Ornette Coleman album The Shape of Jazz to Come, which, all it did was usher in a new age of avant-garde jazz music. And while The Shape of Punk to Come didn't exactly usher in a new wave of experimental punk music, it did prove to be an incredibly influential punk album that changed the way that style of rock music was made in the future. Also worth noting that Refused was not the only punk band to have a connection to jazz in 1998, as New York screamo band Seisha released their first and only album this year, and they're named after a Miles Davis song, so I guess hardcore punk just loved jazz back then. But Refused showed their influence in jazz in their actual music as well, as you would hear jazz sections as well as techno, spoken word samples, a violin, a cello, a melodica, and a tambourine among other instruments not typically associated with punk music, like at all, but mixed into their traditional punk rock and hardcore sound. And no, these instruments are not used in every single song on the album. They're often used more as a way to break up the punk sections than anything else, but that's okay, as while some of the more experimental sections are more forgettable than others, you get things like the violin intro on Tannhauser, where the violin slowly morphs into a slow guitar riff, and it's one of the most incredible intros I've ever heard in a punk song. The idea of The Shape of Punk to Come was to bring back that old school raw punk sound, but to interject it with new life and new ideas, to find new ways to extend these songs into longer pieces and more variety. And when you look at where punk rock was in 1998, where the mainstream was filled with a more pop-oriented sound, and I don't just mean the Green Days and Blink-182s of the world, as even the more traditional punk outfits of the time, artists like Bad Religion, NoFX, and Pennywise, were more influenced by pop music than punk music had ever been previously. It made sense why a band that existed between punk rock and hardcore would want to go back and bring new ideas into an old traditional sound. The songs here are dynamic, fast, heavy, and they're full of aggressively political lyrics that were also starting to leave punk at the time. And even through the techno breakdowns, swirling synth beats, and live crowd samples to come, Refused never lose sight of that punk energy and old school punk roots that is at the core of this record. Refused broke up shortly after the release of this album, but in the 20 years since, all different styles of punk music have taken influence from this album. Everything from mainstream emo music of the 2000s to underground screamo music. No, it didn't create a new genre of punk music, but it added so many new sounds to the lexicon of punk music. Some parts of it have aged a little bit as you've started to see bands take bits and pieces and sounds here and there of what the sound of Punk to Come was doing. But overall, this thing still sounds amazing and is still super fun to listen to.
Number 4.
At number 4, we have Super Ah, the 5th album from influential Japanese noise rock band Boredoms, a band that may not be a household name, but were actually an incredibly influential and important part of the 90s experimental rock scene. Frontman Yamataka Ai has worked with artists such as Sonic Youth, Ween, and John Zorn, and Yoshimi P. Uwe was the inspiration for the title of the Flaming Lips Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots, and she also fronts an excellent noise rock band of her own called OOIOO. And both Yoshimi and I provide vocals and play different forms of percussion throughout the record, as do the other 5 members of Boredoms, as Super Ah is a very drum-heavy album, and nearly every track has seemingly 5 or 6 different types of percussion used at different points, ranging from snares that blast over the fuzzy guitar riffs, to light bongos that are played over a gorgeous synth piece in the closing track. And between those points, you'll also hear bells, a ton of electronics, and a number of surprising instruments along the way. And while Super Ah may seem like an off-putting and inaccessible album if you aren't into heavy experimental music, this was actually Boredom's normal album at the time it was released, and is really one of the more approachable albums in the Japanese experimental scene. There's great influence here from familiar sources such as 60s psychedelic rock music, Japanese folk music, and krautrock. It's just all blended together in a noisy package. But a huge reason why Super Ah is so engaging is because it doesn't just throw its noisiest moments at you. There's a slow build to most of the album, but it builds to utterly unforgettable moments, whether it's of echoed chants that just sound completely amazing, or Yamantaka Ai's screams that don't come all that often, but appear just enough to make an impact when they do. And listening to this album as a whole feels like a journey. Like you have all of this noise and fuzz and different sounds pushing back at you, but then you have these incredible moments that come through, and these really beautiful moments as well, especially in its final track where you feel like you've reached the destination and instead you get one of the most beautiful pieces of music that Boredoms have ever released. There's an unmatched energy here as well, but more in a tense way than in a constantly aggressive sort of way. And again, while it's not necessarily the most approachable album out of the 10 on this list, it is one of the more approachable albums in Japan's experimental rock scene, and certainly one of the best noise rock albums released in the 90s. It's really one of the best albums of its kind and one of my favorite noise rock albums ever.
Number 3.
At number 3, we have Music Has the Right to Children, the debut album from Scottish electronic duo Boards of Canada. It followed in the footsteps of a more abstract and ambient electronic that was being made in England at the time from artists like Aphex Twin and Autechre, but there was something very dreamy and childlike that made Boards of Canada stand out. As Boards of Canada goes even farther towards the ambient direction of their peers, as the tracks here are often built from techno and hip-hop beats with spacey synth backgrounds and field recordings and vocal samples mixed in. And oftentimes it feels like one part of the track is moving very, very slow while another part is moving very fast, but the vibe always stays perfectly chill and dreamy. You have tracks that will take a light piano melody, for example, and put a hard break beat over it, or on a track like Aquarius, where you have a beat that wouldn't sound out of place in a hip-hop song, yet is positioned over a slow synth. And then there's a sample from Sesame Street for the vocals that just makes the whole thing sound like a surreal dream. And while Music Has a Right to Children is certainly very dreamy and even playful at times, there's a nostalgic tone to a lot of what is going on this record. There's samples throughout of children playing, learning, laughing, and so on, including multiple Sesame Street samples. However, none of this is done in an overly cute or forced way. Listening to this record does not try to make you feel like a child, but instead invites reminiscing on childhood from an adult's perspective, and that's a very important distinction. It's much more thoughtful and deliberate sounding than an album full of children's samples might suggest. And after all, Boards of Canada was named after the National Board of Canada, whose educational films the duo watched as children, so there's definitely a theme of education and reflection throughout the album. There's also definitely a vintage feel to the record as well, and makes sense with how it was produced, as the entire project was produced using analog equipment, including a tape recorder, drum machine, sampler, and synthesizer. In some ways, this record also feels like a return to the more minimalistic and analog early 70s of electronic music. And while Boards of Canada would continue to release great albums long after Music Has a Right to Children, this is the record that best defines them. It was immediately influential to other electronic artists and was certainly a huge influence on a little album you might have heard of called Kid A, among countless others. I even hear traces of this album in what would become vaporwave, particularly in how that genre plays with slowed down synths and hip-hop beats. But even ignoring its influence, Music Has a Right to Children is simply a masterful record that has held up brilliantly in the last 20 years. It's a landmark album of ambient and electronic music that still has a very specific vibe to it. It invites you to drift away into a dreamy state that really even 20 years later only Boards of Canada could have created.
Number 2.
At number 2, we have Aquemini from OutKast, one of the most important Southern hip-hop albums ever from one of the most important Southern hip-hop groups ever. OutKast, of course, is the legendary Atlanta duo of Andre 3000 and Big Boy, and they put Southern hip-hop on the map with 1994's Southern playalistic Cadillac Music and its more sci-fi follow-up Aliens. Then they experimented even farther with their third album, a record that not just stands out from the East and West Coast sounds hip-hop was known for, but even from what OutKast was doing previously in their career. This is an album that is bursting with ideas, both musically and lyrically, that are somehow weaved together into a cohesive package. There is so much to this record that it's honestly kind of overwhelming to talk about, but yet is not to listen to. However, I don't want to go any farther without mentioning Aquemini's production, as I think this is one of the biggest achievements in hip-hop production ever. The story goes that the duo lived and worked in the studio for weeks, bringing in a variety of guest musicians to play an instrument here or to record a piece there. However, the production draws influences from so many different sounds. You have jazz music, blues, electronic, gospel, and even progressive rock, as a lot of the samples range from the soul music of Curtis Mayfield and Sly Stone to the progressive rock of Genesis and Camel. Yes, this is a hip-hop album that samples Camel. It also features live instrumentation being mixed with a lot of the digital sounding beats on the album, as well as guest features from artists such as Afrofuturist and funk legend George Clinton, neo-soul singer Erykah Badu, and even the Wu-Tang Clan's Raekwon, a huge endorsement considering how little respect OutKast had received from the East and West Coast worlds of hip-hop at the time. But even with New York starting to take notice, Aquemini is still a proudly Southern album. You still have OutKast's trademark Atlanta diction throughout, and samples going back through Southern history. For example, the track Rosa Parks, where OutKast takes the idea of moving to the back of the bus and changes it to a dance floor anthem, complete with a harmonica solo. It's the kind of idea that would be terrible for just about anybody else, but it works with how Southern and folky everything on the album is, and how positive that track is within the context of the rest of the album, as so many of the other themes here explore the difference between the natural and the synthetic, which also deals with drug culture, a huge theme of the album, especially on tracks like The Art of Storytelling and Y'all Scared, which provide a context to Big Boy rapping about being a drug dealer on Slump, where you start to see the context of why someone would become a drug dealer and then see the ramifications of drug culture on later tracks that it sets up. And all of these different ideas in its production and different lyrical themes allow OutKast to work within multiple styles and blend it all together, as there's an underlying tension throughout the album between going back to the more traditionally Southern sound of their first album and going even farther into the sci-fi experimentation of Aliens. So on this record, you get the gangster tracks and the futuristic ones, but it all works together into the same record. And more than anything else, OutKast's ability to pack so many different ideas into a coherent project is what sets this album apart. It set the blueprint for how to make an expansive hip-hop album that was both epic and accessible, and certainly influenced other epic sounding projects like Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy and Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, and even with one terrible track towards the end that has, let's say, aged extremely poorly, this is still a masterpiece of Southern hip-hop and hip-hop in general. It still feels both Southern as hell and futuristic as hell, and is the defining album of one of the most important groups in hip-hop history.
Number 1.
And the number one album of 1998 is... What, did you really think I was going to leave this one off the list? In the Aeroplane Over the Sea by Neutral Milk Hotel is the perfect example for why retrospective top 10 lists are fun, as this album was not well received when it came out 20 years ago, but in the time since has grown to be widely considered one of the greatest indie rock albums of all time, and in some circles even one of the greatest albums of all time, period. I certainly consider it to be. And despite how amazing this album is, it makes sense why it didn't necessarily find a large audience or receive strong critical acclaim when it first came out, as it took a while to see the influence that Jeff Magnum and his band would have on the future of indie rock, as its odd blend of lo-fi psychedelic rock and folk with acoustic guitars, brass instruments, and all sorts of other oddities, such as a singing saw and accordion, just to name a couple of instruments, would set the tone for the mid-2000s of indie music. You had bands like Arcade Fire and the Decemberists, as well as countless others that paid a huge debt to this album, but maybe a more pressing reason why it took a while for people to come around on In the Airplane Over the Sea is because it's honestly just a really strange album and kind of a deceptive one. Of course, you had all of those different instruments at a time when that was far from expected from a rock album, but you also have a really unusual lyrical theme of this album and an even stranger performance. Much of this album juxtaposes themes of death and violence with themes of love and sex, and while that's maybe not all that unusual for a rock album, it is unusual in the way that Magnum interjects themes of Anne Frank into that, as this record takes a great deal of influence from the Diary of Anne Frank, including songs that are incredibly powerful and sentimental, mixed with songs where... But really, more than anything else, it's the imagery that is invoked by these themes and the performance of all of it that is just something else. So Magnum will often use his voice as an instrument, and there's a great deal of tension just within the way that he performs these lyrics. Take Two-Headed Boy, for example, a track where Magnum's voice is somber for most of it, until it leads to his voice going way past the rest of the mix when he says, "I am listening to hear where you are." It conveys this feeling of hiding in Nazi Germany, especially as that track follows with this militaristic brass instrumental. It's just an incredibly powerful moment that is invoked by the way that it's performed. And then you have a song like Holland's 1945 that deals more directly with Anne Frank and is one of the most heartbreaking and powerful tracks I've ever heard in the indie music scene. Another amazing moment that I can't shake from this album is on The King of Carrot Flowers, which opens this album in 3 parts, where the music is very simplistic, and you have this really cryptic story with these great turns of phrases being used on the first part, only in the second part for Magnum to loudly and strangely professes love of Jesus Christ. Out of nowhere, it's one of the most surreal moments on this entire album, only for that to build into the heaviest, fuzziest moments of lo-fi psychedelic rock on the entire album. It's just amazing. And yes, people have debated what this album means as a whole, what each individual song means, how connected everything is to the themes of Anne Frank, and while I could make an entire long video about my personal interpretation of the album, and I do actually get a lot out of it, but really what makes In the Airplane Over the Sea special is not an objective understanding of what it all means, but the individual moments that come from this record. The album ends with Magnum audibly putting down his guitar and walking away, which is apt because this was the last that we would hear from Jeff Magnum or Neutral Milk Hotel until Magnum released a live solo album in 2001. He made his masterpiece and left. The world just didn't know it yet. And In the Airplane Over the Sea will forever go down as one of the greatest indie rock records of all time, and in my humble opinion, the best album released in 1998. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what albums you think should have made the list, or if you think there might be anything I forgot. We'll have more lists like this coming soon, so make sure to like and subscribe. I'm out.